They say silence holds secrets, but here, silence hid screams. In the winter of 1862, the dark halls of Dusk Creek whispered of Mr. Hargrove, a man whose 4 wives never truly lived nor truly died. What you are about to hear was never meant to be spoken aloud, and once you know, you can never unknow. This is not just a story. It is a warning, a haunting echo of the past that was buried beneath layers of dirt, lies, and blood. And before we go any further into this descent, I need you to like this video, subscribe to DeadScroll, share it with someone who craves the truth, and comment where in the world you're watching from right now, because the shadows are listening and they want to know where you sit as you hear this tale. Dusk Creek was not a place people remembered fondly, even in the 1800s. It was a settlement carved out of desperation, survival, and silence. Townspeople often whispered that the soil itself carried a weight, something heavy, something suffocating. Farmers who tilled the land claimed their animals grew restless at night, staring into corners where nothing stood. Mothers told their children not to wander past the old oak trees because something unseen waited there. And in the center of this hushed town stood the Hargrove estate, an isolated house with windows like watching eyes and walls that seemed too eager to hold in screams. Mr. Hargrove, to outsiders, was a man of dignity and discipline, a man who carried himself with an air of command, someone who could silence a room simply by entering it. But the people closest to him knew something else. They knew the wives he brought into his home did not last. First came whispers, that each wife seemed to fade in spirit within weeks of living there, that their laughter disappeared, their faces grew pale, and their eyes, once bright, dimmed into hollow shadows. Then came the vanishings, one after another, 4 wives in total, and though their graves were never found, their absence was explained away with forged letters, sudden illnesses, and convenient departures that no one could verify. Yet, late at night, villagers swore they heard crying from the estate. Some said they saw pale hands pressed against the windows, reaching out in silence, begging to be released. The town's fear grew, but so did their silence. Because speaking against Mr. Hargrove was not just dangerous, it was a death sentence to Mr. Hargrove was not born into shadows, but he carried them like a cloak. Dusk Creek in 1862 was a town stitched together with gossip and quiet dread, where whispers traveled faster than the wind. His presence commanded the streets, not because of wealth alone, but because of the unsettling stillness that followed him wherever he walked. Men tipped their hats, but never dared look him in the eye. Women pulled their children close when he passed. To some, he was a man of stature. To others, a predator dressed in civility. His home, an estate that stood on the edge of the town, was unlike the rest. Locals said its windows never reflected light, as though the house swallowed every trace of warmth. Travelers who dared to sleep nearby spoke of voices carrying in the night, soft, mournful, yet impossible to trace. But the strangest thing was this: each of his wives entered that house with smiles, beauty, and life, and one by one, they disappeared in the silence. The first wife was spoken of with pity. A tragedy, they called it. A woman struck down by illness, her body gone too soon. No one asked questions. The second wife followed years later, this time blamed on an accident, though no accident was ever seen. The third was a mystery no words could cover. And the fourth vanished so completely that even her name was barely remembered. In any other town, suspicions might have erupted into torches and trials. But Dusk Creek was different. It was a place bound by silence, by the unspoken law that certain truths should never be dragged into daylight. The townspeople looked away, afraid of what they might see if they stared too long. Yet in their silence, guilt grew like rot beneath floorboards. Everyone knew something was wrong. Everyone felt it. And yet, no one dared to act. That is where the true horror lies, not in what Mr. Hargrove did, but in what the town allowed. Because evil thrives not only in darkness, but in the silence of those who choose to ignore it. The village of Dusk Creek was not the kind of place where stories were told openly. Here, whispers were currency, traded behind shuttered windows and beneath the cracked wood of tavern tables. Every man, every woman, and even the children seemed to carry the same look in their eyes, the quiet understanding that something in their town was deeply wrong. They all knew the name Hargrove. They all knew of the estate that loomed on the hilltop like a blackened tooth in the mouth of the landscape. But no one dared to speak of what occurred inside those walls, where the curtains never opened and the lamps never seemed to go out. Mr. Hargrove himself was a figure both feared and envied. His wealth was immense. His reach extended into trade, land, and law. Yet the very same men who shook his hand in daylight would cross themselves when his back was turned. For wives had entered his home, each under strange circumstances. For women, each vibrant, each full of promise, and each vanished into a silence so profound it left their names rotting like unmarked graves in memory. Official records showed marriages, ceremonies, signatures, but no records showed funerals, no records showed graves. And that silence haunted Dusk Creek more than any scream ever could. Neighbors remembered lights in the estate burning through the night, shadows pacing behind heavy curtains, and faint cries that the wind carried across the fields, only to be swallowed by the forest. Those who worked the estate, maids, gardeners, hired hands, never spoke. Those who dared to did not live long. The sheriff claimed nothing was amiss. The church said God alone knew the truth, and the villagers accepted their silence because silence was safer. But the truth, as it seeped like rot through the timbers of the house, was that Mr. Hargrove had not married for love, nor companionship, nor lineage. He had married for power, and power demands sacrifice. What lay in the shadows of that estate was not the end of 4 women, but the beginning of something far darker, a legacy carved from bone and bound in vows of silence. The first wife of Mr. Hargrove was named Eliza. She was said to be beautiful, quiet, and deeply devoted. Villagers remembered her as a figure of grace, walking through the market with a veil drawn, always polite, but always distant. No one ever truly knew her, for Mr. Hargrove kept her close, like an ornament to be admired but never touched by the world. Rumors whispered that she was the daughter of a family in debt, married off to secure Hargrove's fortune. At first, she appeared radiant, her letters to a childhood friend speaking of the grandeur of the manor, the gardens, and the rooms filled with priceless relics from distant lands. But as months passed, her writing grew strange. She described shadows in the hallways, doors she swore she had locked being opened in the morning, and a feeling of someone standing over her bed at night. The friend received one final letter in which Eliza wrote, "I fear this house feeds upon me." After that, nothing. When villagers asked Mr. Hargrove where she had gone, he claimed she was ill and recovering in Bath. Yet no carriage was ever seen leaving the estate, no doctor was summoned, and no grave was dug. Years later, during renovations, a mason swore he found a section of wall hollowed out behind the east wing staircase. Inside was a woman's slipper, faded with age, and a scrap of fabric too fine to belong to a servant. The discovery was quickly silenced, the wall rebuilt, and the mason never worked again. Eliza had vanished, her existence folded into the silent rooms of the manor. And in her absence, Mr. Hargrove soon remarried. Her name was Margaret, a woman known for her wit and intelligence. Unlike Eliza, Margaret was outspoken, a fiery spirit unafraid to challenge Hargrove's stern demeanor. At first, villagers whispered that she had tamed the beast, that Mr. Hargrove seemed gentler in her presence, almost human. But the manor itself does not forgive light. Within months, Margaret grew pale, her laughter vanished, and she rarely appeared in public. Servants recalled her pacing the halls late at night, muttering about music that played though no one had struck the piano. She confided to the cook that she sometimes saw Eliza in the mirrors, a reflection that did not match her own movements. Margaret once stood before the villagers at Sunday Mass and, with trembling hands, declared that the house was cursed, that its walls concealed more than stone. That was the last time she was seen outside the estate. Mr. Hargrove explained her absence with ease. He said she had taken to traveling abroad, enjoying the arts and cultures of Europe. But no one could verify her departure. Her family received no letters. The servants who questioned too loudly about her disappearance were dismissed, their wages cut, their voices silenced. Years later, a traveler swore he had heard sobbing echo through the manor's windows, though the place was dark and lifeless. Another claimed that a pale hand once clutched at the curtain of Margaret's former bedroom, only to vanish when approached. And then came the whispers of a locked room. Servants were forbidden to enter the north chamber, where Margaret had once resided. Yet on stormy nights, faint scratching could be heard from behind the bolted door, as though nails raked against wood. No one dared to open it. Mr. Hargrove, undisturbed, moved forward. Soon enough, a third woman entered his life, and with her came a deeper descent into the manor's nightmare. Her name was Catherine, a woman of striking beauty, with a voice that carried like velvet through the halls of Dust Creek. She was unlike the others, not timid like Eliza, nor outspoken like Margaret. Catherine was poised, a perfect reflection of what Mr. Hargrove wanted the world to see, the picture of a gentleman's bride. To the townsfolk, her arrival felt like a performance, as if she had stepped onto a stage already prepared. And for a time, it seemed she had mastered her role. The dinners grew more extravagant, the grounds manicured, and the great manor glowed with lantern light once again. But beauty and appearances cannot conceal rot for long. Within a year, the perfection began to crack. Servants reported that Catherine avoided the mirrors in the house, often demanding they be covered with heavy cloth. She once shrieked violently at her own reflection, claiming another face was staring back at her, a woman she did not recognize, with eyes full of rage. At night, she would walk the halls in silence, clutching a rosary, whispering prayers under her breath. Sometimes she woke screaming, describing dreams of hands clawing up through the floorboards, dragging her downward into black earth. One servant claimed Catherine confided in her, saying that the walls of the manor breathed, expanding and contracting as if alive. Another told of hearing Catherine's voice singing from the parlor late at night, only to find the room empty and the piano closed. But the most chilling account came from a visiting priest who was asked to bless the house. He described Catherine trembling, her eyes hollow, saying, "Father, you cannot bless stone that feeds." Soon after, Catherine vanished. Hargrove told neighbors she had died of an illness while visiting relatives far away. No burial, no coffin, no ceremony. Just another absence swallowed by the silence of Dust Creek Manor. But the manor itself did not stay silent. From that time on, the villagers began hearing Catherine's song echo faintly across the fields on certain nights, a melody too sorrowful to belong to the living. And yet, the most unsettling truth was this. Mr. Hargrove still smiled, still welcomed new guests, and soon, unbelievably, prepared to marry again. Her name was Lillian, and unlike the wives before her, she came from wealth and power. Her family's fortune rivaled even the Hargroves, and when whispers of her union with Mr. Hargrove spread, the town braced itself for another performance. But there was a difference this time. Lillian carried with her a sharp mind and a calculating gaze. She was not easily deceived, nor was she content to play the role of the ornamented wife. To many, it seemed she had chosen Hargrove not for love, but to uncover what the town whispered behind closed doors. From a moment she stepped into the manor, she sensed the weight of its walls. The air was thicker, heavier, as though 1,000 unspoken words lingered in every corner. Servants who had survived the reign of Catherine refused to enter certain rooms without whispering a prayer. Lillian began to keep a private journal, recording every sound, every shadow, every irregularity she noticed. She wrote of footsteps pacing above her chamber at night, though her room was on the highest floor. She described the smell of damp earth that drifted up through the cracks of the cellar door. She wrote, too, of the mirrors that Catherine once despised. In her words, "The reflections do not obey me. They linger when I turn away, as though someone else remains inside them. Unlike the others, Lillian was not content to suffer in silence. She confronted her husband, demanding to know what had become of the 3 women before her. Hargrove only smiled, his voice calm as ever, assuring her they were resting far from here. But when she pressed further, his eyes grew cold, and his hand gripped her arm so tightly that bruises bloomed by morning. The townsfolk soon noticed a change in Lillian. Once confident, she grew pale, thin, restless. She no longer joined her husband for dinner, but instead locked herself in her chamber, scribbling furiously by candlelight. Some nights, the servants heard her chanting in a language none could place. Others swore they saw her wandering the fields in her nightgown, barefoot, staring up at the windows of the manor as though she were an intruder in her own home. Then, one winter's night, the manor fell silent once more. Lillian was gone. Hargrove announced her death, again without body, ceremony, or stone to mark her existence. But the journal she had kept remained hidden in the house, waiting for hands brave enough to turn its pages. And in those pages, the true horrors of Dust Creek were finally written in ink that could not be erased. The villagers of Dust Creek whispered warnings, but their voices were swallowed by the weight of Mr. Hargrove's name. To speak against him was to invite ruin, and so they kept their suspicions buried beneath silence. Yet silence never kept the truth from festering. It only made it darker. Behind the closed shutters of Hargrove's grand farmhouse, the glow of lanterns flickered long into the night, and strange sounds carried on the wind. Some claimed it was the low, mournful cry of a woman. Others swore they heard the dragging of chains across the floorboards. But none dared to step closer, for those who lingered near the estate after dusk never returned the same. Their eyes carried fear, their voices stuttered, and soon after, they too left Dust Creek without a word. The 4 wives of Mr. Hargrove became a ghostly tale long before their bodies vanished. One by one, they entered his house as brides, and one by one, they disappeared as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The official records told the story of sudden illnesses, tragic accidents, and untimely deaths. But the ground where they were said to be buried yielded no bones, no coffins, only disturbed soil that carried the faint stench of decay. The clergy called it tragedy. The neighbors called it fate. But the shadows whispered a different truth, that the wives had not simply died, but had been claimed. There were nights when travelers passing through Dust Creek reported a woman in white standing in the upstairs window of the Hargrove house. Her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving in soundless pleas for help. Yet when those same travelers alerted the townsfolk, the window was found empty, the glass covered in dust, untouched by any human hand. Still, the sightings persisted, and as the years stretched on, the legend of the Hargrove wives grew. But legends, no matter how terrifying, are not born from nothing. Behind every whisper of a ghostly bride was a deeper truth waiting to surface. For while the town tried to bury the story, the land itself remembered. The soil beneath the Hargrove estate was restless. The roots of the old trees twisted upward, as if reaching for the air, as if trying to tell a story trapped beneath the ground. And one stormy night in 1862, the earth finally spoke. What it revealed would tear open the fragile veil between the living and the dead, and expose the legacy of Mr. Hargrove for what it truly was. Not a tragedy, but a curse. The deeper investigators probed into the Hargrove estate, the more the very land itself seemed to resist them. The soil was loose in some areas, compacted unnaturally in others, and beneath it all, pockets of rot that reeked like unwashed death. Neighbors told them of nights where dogs refused to step foot on the property, howls echoing through the valley as though the animals sensed what the men would not. And inside the house, the presence lingered, not like a ghost, not like a memory, but like a weight pressing against the chest, making breath shallow, thought fragmented. One investigator, a hardened man who had served in the Civil War, confessed in his journal that he felt as though something was feeding on him from within the walls. He abandoned the case days later, leaving behind his notes. Those notes described faint tapping sounds at night, measured and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was counting the hours until it could reveal itself. By the time the local sheriff admitted to the growing terror, the Hargrove case was already far beyond a simple disappearance. Townsfolk began to connect whispers, tales of Mr. Hargrove's charm, the sudden vanishings of his wives, and the eerie fact that not a single grave bore their names. It was said that he could silence gossip with a stare, that the men envied him and the women feared him, yet still were drawn toward his orbit. Power was his true weapon, not the blade or the noose. Power to control, to isolate, to erase. And behind every locked door in that house, power was being sharpened into something unholy. The house itself became a sermon of dominance, a reminder that even in death, some men seek to own what cannot be owned. And for those who dare to enter, the realization dawned slowly. This was no mystery. It was a ritual. Rumors began to spread that Mr. Hargrove had not chosen his wives by chance. Each woman came from a family with either money, land, or influence. Yet strangely, after their union with him, their families reported sudden financial misfortunes, bankruptcies, or inexplicable losses that drove them into ruin. It was as if Hargrove absorbed not just their daughters but their legacies, siphoning the life from entire bloodlines. This pattern, once uncovered by townsfolk, became impossible to ignore. But no one dared accuse him publicly. The man's charm disarmed even his critics. His words carried the rhythm of authority, and his presence filled a room with both warmth and dread. He was not simply a husband. He was a predator cloaked in civility. Visitors to the estate noted the strange absence of laughter, even during the early days of marriage. The wives, radiant and hopeful upon arrival, would grow silent within weeks, their gazes hollow, their shoulders slumped as if under an invisible weight. Neighbors whispered that their smiles seemed rehearsed, their voices flat, as though life had been drained from them. One visitor recalled a haunting moment. Passing by an upstairs window, he saw one of the wives staring out at the fields, her hand pressed against the glass. Her lips moved, shaping words without sound, her eyes wide with terror. When he returned to look again, she was gone. Days later, she too vanished from the household entirely. The sheriff, though bound by duty, hesitated. The town relied on Hargrove's wealth, his donations to the church, his ability to sway investors. To confront him was to confront the very system that held their community together. And so, silence thickened around the estate like fog, and in that silence, the truth festered. Each passing year brought new whispers, new disappearances, and the growing certainty that something monstrous was not only happening, but being permitted to happen. By then, the people of Dust Creek understood. The wives were not simply missing. They were consumed, one by one, in the shadow of a man who had built an empire of fear by the winter of 1864. The whispers had hardened into dread. Families no longer allowed their daughters to walk near the Hargrove estate. Children who wandered too close spoke of hearing cries carried on the wind, faint and broken, as though someone were calling from beneath the earth itself. The Hargrove mansion, once a beacon of wealth, had become a fortress of silence, where curtains were always drawn and lights glowed at strange hours of the night. Townsfolk noticed that grave diggers in Dust Creek were paid in advance for services, though no funerals were ever publicly held. It was as if burials happened in secret, carried out in the dead of night, and only a few dared to imagine who was being lowered into the earth. The church, too, was complicit. Reverend Whitlock spoke of Mr. Hargrove in sermons with reverence, calling him a man of faith, a pillar of morality, a shining example of prosperity. Yet behind closed doors, the Reverend avoided eye contact when questioned about the missing women. Donations from Hargrove lined the church coffers, and in exchange, prayers were offered for the peace of unnamed souls. This corruption spread like a stain, swallowing those who should have stood as guardians. Justice itself had been bought. Inside the mansion, however, there were darker rumors. Servants who briefly worked for Hargrove, and lived long enough to flee. Spoke of strange rooms sealed behind locked doors, rooms that reeked of iron and ash. They claimed that screams could be heard muffled by stone, followed by silence, followed by a sound that chilled the marrow, laughter, low and unearthly, belonging not to a man, but to something that wore man's skin. These accounts, dismissed as drunken ramblings by the town, carried a chilling consistency. Different men and women, on different days, described the same visions, the same sounds, the same smell of burning flesh. And yet, Hargrove never faltered. In public he remained the picture of refinement. His suits pressed, his hair immaculate, his smile dazzling. He attended town meetings, sponsored new roads, and shook hands with politicians. But to those who looked too closely, something seemed wrong in his eyes. They held no warmth, no humanity, only calculation, like a predator waiting for his prey to wander into the trap. Dust Creek had given him power, and now the town itself was shackled by the chains of its own silence. By the spring of 1865, the darkness surrounding the Hargrove estate could no longer be ignored. Farmers reported strange disturbances in their fields near the property. Patches of soil where nothing would grow, where the ground itself seemed burned from beneath. Some claimed they saw pale figures moving at night, drifting between the trees on the Hargrove land, their outlines blurred, their faces indistinguishable. When lanterns were raised to expose them, nothing was found, only the sound of soft footsteps receding into silence. Yet those who witnessed it swore that the figures were women, cloaked in sorrow, walking as though chained to the earth itself. But fear kept mouths closed. Dust Creek's economy relied on Hargrove's wealth, and his influence extended beyond coin. He had men loyal to him, men who patrolled the estate with rifles, ensuring that no curious villager ever wandered too close. And those who did never returned. Officially, they were lost in the swamps, claimed by the treacherous marshlands that stretched for miles. Unofficially, the town whispered a darker truth. They had been taken. Hargrove's appetite, it seemed, was not bound to marriage alone. Inside the mansion, his wives, those who still lived, were seen less and less. When they did appear, they moved like shadows, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, as though the soul had been drained from their bodies. One wife was spotted at the marketplace with bruises along her arms, marks that looked like shackles. When questioned, she only smiled a vacant smile and said, "The master loves me dearly." That phrase alone sent chills through the spine of those who heard it, for it was not spoken with conviction, but with the lifeless monotony of someone repeating words forced upon her. Yet the true horror was still hidden. It lay beneath the mansion, where stone walls dripped with moisture and where a foul stench rose through the floorboards. Survivors, though they were few, spoke of a basement more like a dungeon, where iron rings were bolted into the walls and where screams echoed long into the night. What Hargrove did there was never fully revealed, but the patterns of missing women painted the truth in blood. Dust Creek knew, but Dust Creek stayed silent. Silence, after all, is the currency of the damned. Summer brought no relief to Dust Creek, only heavier air, thicker shadows, and the tightening grip of Hargrove's reign. By then, the townsfolk had resigned themselves to the unspoken law. Never wander near the estate after dark, never question the disappearances, and never, under any circumstance, speak Hargrove's name aloud in prayer. It was said that invoking him, even unintentionally, was enough to draw his attention. And if he noticed you, your fate was sealed. Merchants who delivered goods to the mansion told unsettling tales. They would arrive with crates of wine, fine meats, or bolts of silk, but the women of the house never accepted the deliveries. Instead, it was always Hargrove himself, or one of his armed men. Behind them, a faint music sometimes echoed, low, droning notes that sounded like chanting rather than song. Once, a merchant claimed he glimpsed a circle of women seated around a table inside, their heads bowed, their movements synchronized as though they were part of some ritual. When he looked again, the door was slammed shut. The town preacher, Reverend Ellison, attempted to confront Hargrove in a sermon. He spoke of sin, of a house built on pride and cruelty, and he urged his congregation to resist fear. But his words fell flat in the heavy silence of the pews. No one dared nod in agreement. That same week, the Reverend vanished. His horse was found wandering near the marsh, its saddle torn and wet with blood. The pulpit of Dust Creek remained empty for months afterward, a hollow reminder that defiance was punished with disappearance. Hargrove's wives were now spoken of like ghosts, present but untouchable. Some townsfolk believed there were more than 4 wives, that he took others in secret, women whose names were erased from memory, swallowed by the silence of the estate. But records were inconsistent, and whispers alone could not be trusted. Still, the number of missing women grew. Parents began locking their daughters indoors after sundown, praying that Hargrove's hunger would not extend into their own homes. And then came the night of the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the mansion for hours at a time, revealing silhouettes behind its tall windows. Neighbors swore they saw a procession of women, each dressed in black, each carrying a candle, descending into the earth. The storm raged, thunder rolled, but in the flicker of lightning, the house seemed alive, breathing, shifting, watching. What was buried beneath, its foundations stirred, by the morning after the storm, the earth around the Hargrove estate was scarred. Deep impressions, like trenches, carved their way into the soaked ground, as though something massive had been dragged beneath the soil. Those who lived nearest swore they heard the sound of chains rattling through the night, not above but below, far beneath the foundation of the mansion. Some said the storm had not been natural at all, but summoned, a byproduct of whatever ritual had taken place inside those stone walls. The mansion itself seemed changed. Its windows were darker than before, its chimneys releasing no smoke despite the chill air. For days, there was no sight of the wives, no flicker of candlelight, no movement beyond the gates. And then, without warning, the gates opened at dusk. A carriage rolled out, driven by a pale-faced man who did not resemble anyone from town. No one dared stop him, but witnesses swore the carriage rattled with more weight than passengers alone. Something inside shifted, knocking against the wood, and a faint cry, like that of a child, escaped before it was silenced. Rumors tore through Dust Creek. Some whispered that Hargrove had struck a bargain with forces that did not belong to this earth, and the storm was payment extracted. Others insisted the wives themselves had become something less than human, vessels for whatever power Hargrove served. What unsettled people most was the suddenness with which the mansion seemed to expand its influence. Strangers began appearing in town, travelers dressed in fine clothing who claimed to be guests of Mr. Hargrove. They spoke politely, but their eyes carried a weight that made townsfolk look away. Each of these guests stayed briefly, only to vanish like all the rest. The ledger at the inn grew thin, for few dared to remain in Dust Creek long. The roads emptied after sundown, shops closed earlier, and the church doors, without a shepherd to guard them, remained locked. The town was collapsing, not from fire or famine, but from fear. Yet, through it all, Hargrove remained untouchable. Lawmen from neighboring counties rode in once, spurred by reports of disappearances. They entered Dust Creek with authority, declaring they would bring order to the town. They walked toward the mansion in the early afternoon sun. By nightfall, their horses returned riderless, their saddles empty, their reins dragging in the mud. The message was clear: justice had no place here. The mansion on the hill became more than a house. It became a warning. Every soul in Dust Creek learned to lower their voice when speaking of it, as if words alone might carry up the slope and stir something listening. Mothers told their children not to wander near the estate, and men avoided hunting the woods that bordered its lands. The silence of the place was worse than any sound, for silence meant watching, waiting. Then came a first body. A farmhand, known for drinking too heavily, was found face down in the creek, his throat marked with deep bruises that did not resemble human hands. Some said it looked like the impression of a chain, as though something cold and iron had strangled him. What terrified people most was not the death itself, but the expression on his face. Eyes wide open, mouth locked in a scream that seemed to have continued long after his lungs gave out. Whispers spread faster than fire. Some claimed he had been seen wandering too close to Hargrove's gates only nights before. Others swore they saw one of the wives at her window, staring down at the body being pulled from the water, her pale face expressionless, her hands pressed to the glass as though admiring the work. The town sheriff, pressured by frightened citizens, made one last attempt to bring order. He called for a gathering at the courthouse, insisting they could not let fear dictate their lives. But midway through his speech, the oil lamps flickered, the air grew heavy, and a shrill cry, like a woman's wail, pierced through the rafters though no one else was in the building. Half the townsfolk fled before the sheriff could finish. By dawn, he was gone as well, his office empty, his badge resting on the desk, his revolver left behind. It was after that night that Dusk Creek stopped pretending. No more gatherings, no more plans. The town surrendered to the shadow of the Hargrove estate, leaving its streets emptier, its nights longer, and its people fractured. And yet, Hargrove himself began to be seen again. He would ride through town in his black carriage, nodding politely to those who dared to look his way, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But those who caught his eyes swore they saw something in them, a reflection not of the town, nor the street, but of fire and chains and endless dark halls that stretched far below the earth. The town was no longer alive. It was haunted in its very breath. Businesses closed one by one, leaving their signs to rot in the wind. Horses grew uneasy when passing near the square, and dogs refused to bark at night. Silence had become the language of Dusk Creek, and every soul knew its meaning. The source of that silence was always the same, the Hargrove mansion, looming like a black tooth above the valley. Yet in the middle of this fear, an unexpected visitor arrived. A preacher, not from the county, not even from a state, but a wandering man dressed in plain black robes, carrying only a Bible bound in chains. He called himself Elias Craven. His voice was low, his gaze unsettling, and his sermons were filled not with hope, but with warnings of sin, damnation, and covenants sealed in blood. He drew a small crowd, desperate for answers, desperate for someone who might name the evil in their midst. Elias spoke of the Hargrove wives, not as women, but as vessels. He said their faces were masks, their hands borrowed, their voices not their own. He claimed that Mr. Hargrove was not their husband at all, but their keeper, an intermediary who fed something ancient, something that demanded sacrifice. The preacher's words shook the crowd, but what rattled the most was his insistence that every death in Dusk Creek had not been random, but chosen. Each soul taken, he said, was part of a ledger, and when a ledger is full, the doors below will open. That night, Elias Craven led a group of men toward the mansion. Torches in hand, they marched through the crooked woods, voices trembling as they muttered half prayers, half curses. But only two returned. Their torches had been snuffed out by a wind that came from inside the mansion itself. They swore the doors opened without touch, that a cold draft swept over them carrying the scent of iron and salt. One man fell to his knees, screaming that he saw chains moving on their own, snaking across the floor like serpents. The other claimed he saw the wives standing at the staircase, smiling with mouths that did not end where they should have. The men who survived never spoke again after that night. They lived on, yes, but hollow, their eyes sunken, their words stolen. As for Elias Craven, his Bible was later found at the creek's edge, its pages torn and waterlogged, the chains broken clean through. After the preacher vanished, the town fell deeper into its paralysis. Doors were bolted before the sun even touched the trees, and lanterns burned through the night, not for light, but for protection. Still, nothing could keep the dread away. It was said that if one listened closely at midnight, a sound could be heard drifting from the Hargrove mansion, soft at first, like a lullaby, then twisting into something closer to a dirge, a hymn for the dead. Some swore the voices belonged to the four wives, singing in unison, their tones weaving like a net over the town, dragging fear into every home. A pattern soon revealed itself. Every 7 nights, a new disappearance would take place. It did not matter who, children, men, women, even the elderly. Their homes would be found empty, their beds neatly made, their windows unlocked. The only trace left behind was a faint smear of ash across the doorframe. People began marking their thresholds with salt, with crosses, with knives hammered into the wood. None of it worked. The sheriff, once the voice of order, abandoned his post. His last recorded act was entering the mansion with 6 deputies. Not one returned. Their horses came back riderless, eyes wild, foam dripping from their mouths. Dusk Creek had no law after that, only silence. But rumors spread of one woman, an outsider who had married into the town shortly before the disappearances began. Her name was Mercy Galloway, and unlike the others, she claimed she had spoken to the wives. Not face to face, but in dreams that felt more real than waking life. She said they visited her while she slept, whispering secrets about the house, about the true nature of Mr. Hargrove. She claimed he had never been a man at all, but a mask worn by something older. Each wife was not taken from him. Each was given to him. And each wife was bound by a vow that chained not only their souls, but the town itself. Mercy tried to rally others to flee, to abandon Dusk Creek before the 7th cycle was complete. But fear had rooted the people to their land. They would not leave their homes, their barns, their families buried in the soil. Mercy left alone, vanishing into the woods with nothing but a lantern. Some said she was the only one who ever escaped. Others whispered she was taken just the same, that her lantern was seen swinging from the highest gable of the mansion the following night, by the 19th week of horror. Dusk Creek no longer resembled a town. It resembled a waiting room for the grave. Fields went unharvested, shops were shuttered, and the river that once carried trade now only carried silence. Yet, the mansion stood untouched, looming at the edge of the valley like a sentinel. No one dared approach it, not even in daylight. But still, the voices carried across the distance, threading through the air like smoke, pressing into people's ears whether they wished to hear them or not. It was then that strange carvings began to appear across town. They weren't etched by human hands, at least not willingly. On the trunks of trees, on doorposts, even burned into the ground itself, appeared a symbol, a circle divided into 4 parts, with what looked like a hand drawn in the center. Some believed it represented the wives, each bound in 1/4 of the circle, their hands united in eternal pact. Others claimed it was far older, a sigil not meant for human understanding. But one thing was certain, wherever the symbol appeared, someone disappeared that night. People tried destroying the markings, but they would always return by morning, darker, deeper, and wider than before. A farmer tried to burn one into ashes, only to find his own barn collapsing in fire the next night, his family gone with it. The survivors began to understand. The symbols were not warnings. They were invitations. And then came the night of the blood moon. The wives' voices rose louder than ever, their hymn shaking window panes, rattling iron pots from hooks, making cattle drop dead where they stood. People fell to their knees, covering their ears, begging God to intervene. But no salvation came. Instead, a shadow moved across the valley, not a figure but a mass, as though the land itself had grown teeth. From within that shadow, the mansion's windows lit up one by one, glowing not with fire but with a sickly golden light. Some swore they saw silhouettes. 4 women standing in the highest window, hands clasped together, their faces turned outward toward the town. And then, slowly, the shadow crawled closer. That night, 12 homes stood empty by dawn. Beds made, tables set, doors left wide open. Not a body, not a sound, not even a footprint remained. Only the circle with the hand burned into the ground before each doorway. By the 20th night, the survivors of Dusk Creek understood something chilling. This was no longer about fear or about death. This was about devotion. The missing were not dragged, they were called. Families swore their loved ones had risen from bed, eyes open, yet vacant, walking calmly into the dark as though answering a prayer no one else could hear. Some tried to hold them back, but their strength was inhuman. Frail women tore through the grip of husbands twice their size. Children pried open locked doors with ease, their little feet carrying them straight toward the mansion, as if invisible hands guided them. The whispers of the wives had grown into sermons. Entire passages filled the air, rolling like waves across the valley. They spoke not in English, nor in any tongue recorded by scholars, but those who listened claimed they understood perfectly. It was a language older than Scripture, older than the land itself. And what it promised was not salvation, it was ascension. The wives were offering something beyond life and beyond death. Something eternal, but grotesque. Desperation forced the townsfolk to fight back. A small group of men, armed with rifles and lanterns, gathered the courage to march to the mansion. They entered at midnight, swearing they would put an end to the curse. The town held its breath as the men disappeared into the dark. For hours, there was silence. Then, one rifle shot cracked through the night, followed by a scream. Not of pain, but of laughter, thick, layered laughter, as if dozens of throats echoed it at once. At dawn, the townsfolk discovered the rifles abandoned on the lawn, each one bent as if twisted by impossible strength. There was no trace of the men, except their boots, lined neatly in pairs upon the mansion steps, as though they had willingly left them behind before entering. The wives grew louder still that evening. Their words spoke of for who were betrayed, for who were bound, for who would reign. Some villagers began to whisper that Mr. Hargrove himself was not their master, but their offering, that his role had ended long ago, and it was the wives who had carried on, feeding the mansion with fresh souls to ensure their dominion. But the question no one dared speak aloud was the most terrifying of all. If the wives ruled, then who, or what, ruled them? By the 21st night, the boundary between dream and waking life no longer existed in Dust Creek. People began to see the mansion even when their eyes were closed. In sleep, they walked its endless corridors, hearing the steady drip of water somewhere deep below. The walls breathed, the windows wept condensation, and always, always, the wives stood waiting. Their pale faces glowed faintly, as if lit from within, their hands outstretched in mockery of comfort. They whisper names, not random names, but the exact names of those who were still alive in town. It became clear that the mansion was not merely a place, it was a hunger. It fed on attention, on thought, on fear. The more the villagers tried to resist, the deeper it lodged in their minds. Some swore the structure itself had grown larger. Windows appeared where none had been before. The roof stretched taller, casting longer shadows. The mansion was expanding, as if swelling with the number of souls it had consumed. One woman, a widow named Margaret, decided she would burn it down. She had lost her son, her daughter, and finally her last brother to its call. She marched into the woods with oil and torches, swearing she would end it or die trying. The town watched from afar as flames rose against the night sky. The fire blazed higher, devouring the outer walls in a furious roar. For a moment, hope returned to the people of Dust Creek. But then the flames bent inward. The fire did not spread, it was swallowed. The mansion drank the blaze as though it were thirsting for it. The glow vanished. The smoke collapsed back into the earth, and the building stood untouched, darker than ever. Margaret was never seen again, though her charred shoes were later found at the tree line, pointing directly toward the mansion. That night, the hymn of the wives changed. It became sharper, louder, almost triumphant. Some villagers swore they could make out English words among the ancient tones. The fire is ours. The breath is ours. The blood is ours. Dust Creek had run out of weapons. Fire had failed. Guns had failed. Prayer was useless. The only thing left was obedience or silence. And neither option felt like survival. That be why the 22nd chapter of this nightmare, Dusk Creek was no longer a village. It was a wound that refused to close. The few who still lived there walked with hollow eyes, their movements slow, as though something unseen dragged at their limbs. Those who spoke at all mumbled in fragments, repeating lines from the wives' hymns without realizing it. Their voices layered over one another until silence itself was a rare and precious thing. The mansion had become bolder. It no longer waited in the woods, hidden in its shadows. No, its reflection began to appear in places it did not belong. One man opened his well to draw water, only to see not the depths of a dark shaft, but the glitter of the mansion's windows staring back at him. A child stared into a mirror and swore she saw the wives behind her, though she stood alone in her house. Farmers looked to the horizon at dusk and saw the rooftop spires where no spires should be. It was not simply a house anymore. It was an infection. A meeting was called in what remained of the town square. The last men and women gathered, their faces worn, their nerves shattered. They debated what to do, though none spoke with confidence. Some wanted to flee, yet those who had tried were either dragged back screaming or returned days later, dazed and unwilling to speak of what they had seen. Others believed that the mansion had to be confronted, that to ignore it was to surrender. Then an elder, a man named Elias Crow, spoke. His voice trembled, not from age, but from what he had witnessed. He claimed that the wives were not prisoners of the house, nor victims of Mr. Hargrove's cruelty. They were its architects. They had built it not with wood and nails, but with devotion, with secrets, with the darkest ritual of all, the surrender of their own humanity. The mansion does not want to be destroyed, Elias whispered, because it cannot be. It is not built of stone. It is built of memory, of submission. And as long as we think of it, as long as we fear it, it grows. A silence followed, but then came a scream from the edge of the square. A woman had collapsed, her body jerking violently as though invisible hands were pulling her apart. Her mouth opened wide, and through her lips came not her voice, but the chant of the wives. Do not deny us. Do not forget us. Do not leave us. The mansion had heard the meeting, and it would not allow rebellion. The whispers about Blackridge Hollow never rested with the dead. In fact, the deeper the townsfolk tried to bury the truth, the louder the voices of the past seemed to rise. Men would pass by the abandoned farm at dusk, clutching lanterns, swearing they could hear the sound of chains rattling beneath the soil. Not the wind, not the creak of old beams, chains, as though something was still bound below, yearning for release. Old hunters refused to cross that stretch of land. Even their hounds refused to approach, howling and backing away with their tails between their legs. And yet, when questioned, the officials gave the same cold answer. There is nothing there. The hollow holds no secrets. But silence itself is often the most suspicious sound. When the town blacksmith vanished after claiming he had found bones stacked like wood near the barn, the authorities dismissed it as drunken nonsense. Yet his hammer was found, buried in the mud, as though ripped from his hand. These incidents piled one after another until no man in Blackridge Hollow truly believed the farm was just a ruin. It had become a living scar, pulsing with reminders of those whose blood had watered its soil. The Blackridge family silence was bought, forced, and in many cases buried with them, but the ground doesn't lie. Earth keeps memory. Soil records pain. And in every dark crevice of that farm, there is a memory that refuses to be silenced. The farm became more than a ruin. It became a threshold. Travelers passing through Blackridge Hollow spoke of it as though it were a forbidden altar, a place where human cruelty had carved open the veil between the living and the dead. One merchant swore that on a moonless night he saw figures moving in the barn, hunched shadows, small and frail, swaying as if still chained to the beams. He left his cart behind, abandoning both horse and goods, and ran until his lungs burned. His hair, once black, turned white within a year. And then there were the children. Those who grew up in Blackridge Hollow told stories of dares, approaching the farm at dusk, pressing one's ear to the barn door, waiting to hear the breathing that lingered inside. Some laughed, some ran, but a few never came back. The family spoke little of it, choosing instead to vanish into silence, leaving empty chairs at dinner tables. Officials, of course, labeled them runaways, but the townsfolk knew better. The Hollow kept taking, even after the killers were gone. And as the years stretched into decades, the farm earned a new name whispered in taverns and firesides: the Acre of Chains. A place where cruelty was so thick, it soaked into the wood, into the iron, into the very marrow of the earth itself. Some claimed the chains would move if touched, sliding like serpents, eager to bind again. The Hollow was no longer just history. It had become something living, feeding, and patient. By 1840, the farm had become a site of whispered pilgrimage. Not the kind rooted in faith, but in dread. People came not to pray, but to confirm what they feared to be true: that evil could anchor itself to a place and never loosen its grip. Journalists who dared investigate returned shaken, their accounts littered with contradictions. Some described hearing the faint sound of rattling metal, though no wind stirred. Others claimed the barn still smelled of blood, copper-heavy and suffocating, as though time itself refused to clean the air. A doctor from a neighboring town conducted his own study, visiting under the guise of rational inquiry. He laughed at the stories, mocked the villagers, and scoffed at the idea of curses. Yet when he emerged from the barn, he was silent. He never published his notes. He withdrew from medicine entirely and lived out the remainder of his life in reclusion, refusing even to pass through Blackthorn Hollow. Those who had known him said his eyes were no longer the same, constantly searching corners, scanning doorways, as though something had followed him home. The farm did not need its killers anymore. It had become a killer itself, silent, patient, and unbound. The chains in the barn grew colder each year, as though storing memory, as though waiting for flesh. And so, the Hollow's legend spread like smoke across counties, carried by those who dared to glance into its dark maw and walked away forever changed. The Hollow had grown into more than a local tale. It was now a contagion of the mind. Men who had never set foot in Blackridge spoke of it in hushed tones over bar tables, their voices low as though the very name summoned its presence. Sailors carried the story to distant harbors, where it mutated into something darker, each retelling adding a layer of terror. It became less about the Blackridge family themselves and more about the force that had birthed them, the same force that seemed to linger still. Some said it was older than the Hollow, older than the soil, older than the farm itself. That perhaps the family had not been killers at all, but merely vessels chosen to enact its hunger. A priest who attempted to consecrate the land was found 3 days later by the roadside, his robes torn, his hands blistered black as though burned from within. He never spoke again. Entire villages nearby began to suffer collective nightmares. Visions of barns filled with screaming mouths, of chains that writhed like serpents, of children who begged for release but had no eyes. Those who tried to dismiss it as hysteria quickly found themselves plagued as well, their sleep poisoned, their waking hours haunted. It was as if the Hollow had extended invisible roots into their minds, weaving them into its domain whether they consented or not. The land no longer merely remembered blood. It demanded it. The Hollow no longer whispered, it roared. Its hunger became evident in ways that could not be denied. Livestock across the neighboring counties were found gutted, their carcasses strung from trees as though arranged by unseen hands. No tracks, no tools, no human trace. Only the hollow echo of something that wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. Children walking home from school vanished in the span of a single breath, their shoes left neatly in the dirt, their voices trailing as if swallowed into the wind. The people of Blackridge began locking their doors at sundown, yet the locks rattled each night, tested from the other side, as if mocking their attempts at safety. Survivors spoke of hearing soft tapping on their windows, always in patterns of 3, followed by the sound of laughter far too deep for any man, far too jagged for any woman. The Hollow was not just taking, it was announcing itself. The authorities, desperate to quell the hysteria, sealed the roads and declared the place uninhabitable. But the fear could not be sealed away. Fear itself is a contagion, and by now the Hollow had infected every man, woman, and child within reach. The story of the Blackthorn family had dissolved into something greater. The legend of a land that fed on life, memory, and sanity itself. The Hollow had become more than a place. It was a presence, and presence cannot be fenced in. The investigators who dared enter Blackthorn Hollow came armed with lanterns, maps, and revolvers. But none of those tools meant anything against what awaited them. The first team, 5 men from the county sheriff's office, returned 3 days later with eyes glazed, their mouths stitched shut with rough black thread. No one admitted to sewing them, yet the thread was coarse and wet, as though it had been pulled directly from the soil. They could not speak, only tremble violently when questioned, as if their bodies still remembered something their minds had been forced to erase. The second team never came back at all. Only their horses returned, riderless, bleeding from eyes and nostrils. By the third attempt, the Hollow had become infamous, but still, federal agents insisted. They marched in with grim resolve, boasting that they did not believe in superstition. Within hours, they were seen wandering the edges of the tree line, walking in perfect unison, their faces blank, their movements stiff, as though strings were tied to their limbs. Witnesses swore their lips moved, not in prayer, not in language, but in repetition, 3 words over and over again. No one could agree on what the words were. Some claimed it was a command, others a plea. But what terrified people most was the rhythm, the cadence, unnatural, not human, almost mechanical, yet carried on the breath of living men. Those who stayed long enough to hear it found their thoughts repeating, like a broken record inside their own skulls. The Hollow did not simply consume, it rewrote. And those who investigated soon realized they had become its instruments. That by the winter of 1810, whispers of Blackthorn Hollow had spread beyond the valley, carried by fugitives, drifters, and trembling survivors who had seen too much. Newspapers of the time refused to print the stories, dismissing them as frontier superstition, yet the rumors traveled faster than ink. Traders avoided the roads that passed near the Hollow. Stagecoaches detoured miles out of their way, even if it cost days of travel. Soldiers stationed nearby spoke of hearing screams in the fog, of children's laughter echoing through the trees where no children lived. What began as a local horror soon became a national one. The Hollow was no longer just a cursed farmstead. It was spoken of in sermons, whispered in taverns, and scrawled in coded letters by men who swore the government was trying to keep its true history buried. And perhaps they were right. Records from federal archives, detailing early surveys of the area, began to vanish. Entire pages were ripped from county ledgers. Maps reissued by Washington quietly omitted the Hollow, as if erasing its name from paper could erase the truth itself. Yet the erasure had the opposite effect. It fueled the fear, it magnified the legend. People said the Hollow was not just haunted, but dangerous to memory itself. That even writing about it left ink cursed, smudging into unreadable stains overnight. By then, the Hollow had become forbidden territory, a place where no law, no church, no human authority could tread without consequence. And the darker question emerged. If even the government could not suppress it, what force truly held dominion there? The deeper one looks into the Hollow, the clearer it becomes. The land itself never belonged to man. Long before settlers carved their farms into the soil, before boundary markers and deeds, before the English tongue gave it the name Blackthorn, something older had already laid claim to it. The indigenous people of the region spoke carefully when the subject arose. Even their elders, men who feared nothing of wild beasts or enemy tribes, refused to step into the Hollow. They had a word for it, a word that did not translate to haunted or cursed, but to something closer to occupied. They warned that the Hollow was not empty, not free for human hands, but already owned by a presence whose roots ran deeper than stone. The settlers who dismissed those warnings met with misfortune far beyond coincidence. Livestock would turn up mutilated. Crops withered in the middle of lush seasons. Children were born sickly, some with features the mothers refused to recognize. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns stretching across decades. And those who tried to leave found themselves stalked by shadows that stretched longer than the sun should allow, whispers that followed them to new towns. The Hollow punished trespassers, not instantly, but patiently. Ownership implied rights, and the force that claimed the Hollow exercised them ruthlessly. It was not the work of restless spirits or demons in the way the church preached. No, this was older. This was territorial. It suggested intelligence, rules, and boundaries, an ancient dominion that did not welcome human defiance. The settlers may have planted their crosses and built their barns, but the Hollow reminded them at every turn. The land was never theirs to take. The disappearances were never random. To the untrained eye, they may have looked like simple abductions or tragic accidents, but if you align them across time, they form a pattern, an order so precise it cannot be coincidence. Every 7th year, someone vanished from the Hollow. Sometimes it was a child wandering too far. Sometimes a farmhand trudging home in the dark. Sometimes an entire family that simply never woke up to see the morning sun. But the intervals remained eerily consistent, as if dictated by a calendar not written by human hands. Even the way bodies were sometimes found spoke of something ritualistic. The placement, the absence of blood, the twisted symbols carved into bark or left in ash. Local clergy condemned it as satanic. The men of science dismissed it as hysteria. Yet, neither could explain why the cycle held, why the Hollow demanded with such regularity, as though keeping balance with an ancient contract. Survivors who escaped the Hollow's pull spoke of dreams repeating the same vision. A procession in the trees, a figure cloaked in shadow, leading souls deeper into the earth. It was less murder than collection, a harvest, precise and methodical. Those taken were not simply gone, they were claimed. And for those who studied too closely, a disturbing theory emerged. The Hollow wasn't just killing to satisfy hunger or rage. It was keeping count. It was maintaining a covenant made long before the settlers, long before written record, a covenant that demanded bodies as tribute. The Hollow was not chaos. It was law. Hidden deep within the archives of the old diocese were documents never meant for public eyes, journals and sealed letters written by priests who had been stationed near Hollow Creek in the early 1700s. These men of the cloth had encountered something they could not explain, something that shook the foundation of their faith. They wrote of villagers whispering about an agreement struck long before the first chapel bell rang, a pact sealed in silence, blood, and earth. Some priests claimed they had seen processions themselves, hooded figures leading victims into the woods at dusk, chanting words not of Latin, but something older, harsher, guttural. One letter, trembling in its handwriting, admitted that the church knew more than it ever confessed. The Hollow demanded a life every 7 years, and those who tried to resist often suffered double the loss. Families that refused to surrender one would find two taken. Priests described these events as the hand of God turned backward, but none dared speak aloud what they truly feared, that this was not divine punishment, but a contract between man and something that predated man. The Vatican, according to the hidden accounts, had instructed silence. Officially, the disappearances were to be attributed to wolves, sickness, or native superstition. Unofficially, the priests begged Rome for guidance, and Rome responded only once. Do not provoke what has been bound. Contain, do not confront. It was the most chilling instruction of all. Acknowledgement without denial, an admission that the covenant was real, but untouchable. The priests buried their knowledge in locked cabinets, sealed archives, and forgotten corners of stone basements beneath churches. Yet, what they feared most was not the Hollow itself, but the moment the covenant would finally require more than just lives. It would require obedience. When fragments of those sealed priestly records finally surfaced in the late 20th century, they ignited a storm among the small circle of historians brave enough to read them. A scholar named Dr. Leonard Halloway, working in the archives of an abandoned seminary in Massachusetts, stumbled upon one of the journals tucked behind a crumbling shelf. His hands trembled as he translated the faded ink, each line dragging him deeper into a world of fear the church had desperately tried to erase. He took photographs, copied notes, and sent them to colleagues across the country. But before his work could be published, Holloway vanished, his apartment ransacked, his papers shredded, and his research files inexplicably corrupted. Some whispered that the church intervened. Others claimed the hollow itself had reached across centuries to silence him. A few photocopies survived, and these were enough to spread rumors like wildfire. Local historians, who had long dismissed Hollow Creek's disappearances as myth, suddenly reconsidered. Here was documented testimony, dating back centuries, that aligned disturbingly with the oral stories passed down by families who still lived near the area. Panic spread quietly, not to the public at large, but among scholars, archivists, and religious historians. Some attempted to warn communities, but doors were slammed, conferences canceled, and careers destroyed. Even today, only fragments of Holloway's findings circulate in obscure circles of forbidden history. Yet one detail always emerges, a single chilling phrase repeated in multiple journals. The covenant waits. It remembers. And when silence is broken, it will collect. That phrase has haunted every historian who has dared to touch this story. Many chose to walk away. But for those who did not, the hollow still calls. Its pull is strong as ever, reminding them that some truths are not only forbidden, but fatal. The Hollow Creek account does not end in the past. It bleeds into the present. To believe this story is only about 312 vanished souls is to misunderstand its depth. What was hidden in that valley was not just a community's tragedy, but a template, a method of silence, control, and vanishing that institutions across centuries have refined and replicated. When we look at unexplained disappearances, suppressed archives, or the sudden erasure of whistleblowers in our own time, the shadow of Hollow Creek looms like an unbroken chain. The priests who wrote in trembling ink, the scholars who vanished after glimpsing fragments, the families who lived under generations of whispered terror, all of it points to a truth most cannot face. The mechanisms that devoured Hollow Creek are not gone. They have only evolved, cloaked now in bureaucracy, in science, in systems so vast and polished that their grip is invisible. The covenant of silence is not a myth. It is an inheritance passed down from religious orders to modern power structures, each guarding the same ancient techniques of control. And if you are hearing this now, it means the wall has cracked and the silence has been pierced. The question that remains is whether the hollow will collect again, whether the covenant still waits, watching from the dark edges of history, ready to take those who dare to speak of it aloud. Some stories, once unearthed, are not just stories. They are warnings. And Hollow Creek's warning is simple. The moment you look too closely, it is already looking back at you.